My people, the most powerful religious leader just said something that 266 popes before him refused to say for nearly 600 years. I'm sorry. Sorry for the role that the Catholic Church played in legitimizing, justifying, and institutionalizing one of the greatest crimes against humanity, the transatlantic slave trade. In his inaugural encyclical, Pope Leo issued a historic apology for the institutional church's complicity in slavery and colonial violence. His exact words, quote, "It is impossible not to feel deep sorrow when contemplating the immense suffering and humiliation endured by so many. For this, in the name of the church, I sincerely ask for pardon." He called it a wound in Christian memory. And my people, let's be very clear. This was not just a symbolic statement, because for centuries, the Catholic Church was not simply watching slavery happen from the sidelines. The church helped create the moral framework that justified conquest. It issued decrees that gave European empires religious permission to invade lands, seize resources, and enslave non-Christian peoples across Africa and the Americas. In other words, slavery was not only economic, it was spiritualized. And now, 574 years later, the Vatican is finally acknowledging it. Now, the mainstream media is covering this as a historic moment, and it is. But here's the part that they're barely talking about. The man who just made that apology, his family is Black. His grandparents were listed as Black in census records, and somewhere along the way, his family passed as white to survive. So think about the irony of this moment. The man leading the institution that signed the permission slip for the African slave trade carries the blood of the people that document was used to enslave. Let that sit for a moment. Today, we're not just talking about the apology. We're talking about a 574-year story, a document that nobody ever taught you about in school, a family secret hidden inside the Vatican, a UN vote that should have made world headlines and barely did, and the question that sits underneath all of it: what actually comes after sorry? Because my people, apologies open doors, and this apology opens the door to conversations that the world has avoided for centuries. Let's break it down. Hello and welcome to The Breakdown, where we center Africa and the Black world in today's global affairs. I'm your host, Sandra Bebu Boateng. Now, if you're new here, welcome to the family. Please take a quick second to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. And when you're done watching, or as you're in the process of watching, drop a comment, tell me where you're tuning in from. You know, this is a global community, and I love knowing where in the world you're joining us from. All right, now, let's get into it. My people, before we talk about the apology, we need to talk about what is being apologized for, right? Because most people, when they think about the Catholic Church and slavery, they think about individual Christians who participated in the slave trade. You know, priests who looked the other way, missionaries who showed up alongside colonial armies. And yes, all of that happened. But this apology is about something much more specific, much more deliberate, and much more damning. It's about a document, a single piece of paper signed in Rome in 1452 that gave Europe's kings the legal and spiritual authority to invade Africa, to capture its people, and enslave them forever. The document is called Dum Diversas, and I can almost guarantee nobody taught you in school. So here's the scene. The year is 1452. Pope Nicholas V is sitting in Rome. Portugal has been raiding the coastline of West Africa. Just 8 years earlier, In 1444, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Europe. 235 people sold in a market in Lagos, Portugal, like cattle. The Portuguese king wants more slaves. He wants to keep going. But he wants something first. He wants God's blessing. So he writes to the Pope, and the Pope, Pope Nicholas V, writes back. On June 18, 1452, he issues a papal bull called Dum Diversas. And inside that document, he gives King Afonso V of Portugal the authority, in the name of God, to do the following: invade, search out, capture, subjugate, and reduce to perpetual servitude all pagans, unbelievers, and enemies of Christ. Perpetual servitude, forever, authorized by Rome, signed by the Pope. Now let me explain what a papal bull is, because this matters, right? A papal bull is not a suggestion. It is not a recommendation. It is the Pope speaking with the full authority of God on earth, in writing, officially, for all time. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church was not just a religious institution. It was one of the most powerful governing forces in the world. When the Pope signed a document, it had the force of international law, So this wasn't just moral permission. This was legal cover. This was God's signature on the slave trade. And it didn't stop there, no. The following year, 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued a second bull called Romanus Pontifex. This one went even further. It gave Portugal exclusive rights to territories along the entire west coast of Africa, the right to trade in enslaved people, the right to conquer and to keep. Two documents. Together, they became the foundation of what is known as the doctrine of discovery, the legal and religious theory that justified European colonial seizure of African and indigenous lands for the next 5 centuries. And here's the part that will stop you cold. These bulls were not a one-time decision. They were confirmed, renewed, reinforced by 4 separate popes. Pope Calixtus III in 1456, Pope Sixtus the Fourth in 1481, and Pope Leo X in 1514. 4 popes over 62 years re-signing the same permission. This was not a mistake. This was not one man's lapse in judgment. This was institutional policy. And that's not even the most shocking part. And if you're standing, I really need you to sit for this one. For 574 years, through abolition, through civil rights, through independence movements, through every apology and every reckoning, no pope had ever stood up and said, we did this. The Vatican did this. Not just individual Christians, us. Nobody. Until this week, on Monday.
The Pope's family, his maternal grandfather, Joseph Martinez, and his wife, Louise, in 1900 are listed as black, not as Creole, but black in Louisiana in the federal census. And 1910 are listed as white in the federal census, still in Louisiana. 1920, they moved as part of the Great Migration to Chicago, and they passed as white. In 1930 and 1940, they're white. So, you know, he knows that story. So that's a very American story.
Now, my people, this is the part of the story that nobody is telling you. And I need you to stay with me here because this is extraordinary. The man who made this apology is Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost, American, the first American Pope in the history of the Catholic Church. And within hours of his election last year, genealogists started digging into his family tree. And what they found changed everything. Everything. Let's start in New Orleans, the 7th Ward. The year is 1900. There's a couple living there. Joseph Martinez, a cigar maker, and his wife, Louise Bequie. They are listed in census records that year as Black. Joseph Martinez was born in Haiti. Yeah, Haiti, the country that staged the only successful slave revolution in human history. The country that defeated Napoleon's army and declared independence in 1804. The country that was punished for that very freedom for the next 2 centuries, forced to pay reparations to France, isolated by the international community, strangled economically for the crime of freeing itself. The Pope's grandfather came from Haiti. And Louise Bequie, his grandmother, was born in New Orleans, a free woman of color in the 7th Ward, the historic heart of New Orleans' Creole community. The Creole community of New Orleans is one of the most extraordinary and most misunderstood communities in American history. Free people of color who existed in the complicated space between slavery and freedom, between Black and white, navigating a society that wanted to crush them from both directions. Joseph and Louise married in 1887. They had children. They built a life. And then, in 1910, they left. They joined what historians call the Great Migration. 6 million Black Southerners who fled the American South between 1915 and 1970, fleeing Jim Crow, fleeing lynchings, fleeing a system designed to keep them poor and terrorized. They headed north to Chicago, to Detroit, to New York. Joseph and Louise went to Chicago. And here's where the story takes a turn that should make every single one of us stop and think. In New Orleans, in every census record, in every document, they were listed as Black. But once they arrived in Chicago, they were listed as white. And there's a Creole term for this, passé blanc, to pass as white. The family historian who uncovered all of this, Jari Honora, put it this way, quote, fairly consistently, they are listed in census and other records in New Orleans as Black and mulatto. But once they migrate to Chicago, those identifiers are all switched to white. I don't fault them at all. I see it as a decision to safeguard their livelihoods, an economic decision to shift racial identities, end quote. To safeguard their livelihoods. Think about what that means. This family looked at the world around them, the segregation, the violence, the closed doors, the burning crosses, and they made a calculation, a survival calculation. They chose to disappear into whiteness so that their children could eat, so their children could work, so their children could live. And it worked. Their daughter, Mildred, was born in Chicago, listed as white, grew up as white, married, had children. One of those children became the Pope of the Catholic Church. And the Pope's own brother, John Prevost, told the New York Times that the family never discussed their Creole ancestry. Quote, it was just never an issue, he said. Never discussed, buried, survived by silence. But then Henry Louis Gates Jr. shows up, the Harvard professor, yes, the host of Finding Your Roots, the man who has spent his career recovering exactly these kind of erased histories. He traveled to the Vatican, sat across from Pope Leo, and hand-delivered a genealogical report that traced the Pope's ancestry back 5 generations across 4 continents. What the report confirmed? The Pope has at least 17 Afro-Creole ancestors, free people of color in Louisiana before the Civil War, enslaved people, and in the painful complexity that defines Black American history, enslaved people who, after gaining their freedom themselves, became slave owners. His ancestor, Marie Jean, was freed from slavery and then went on to own more than 1,000 acres of land and at least 20 enslaved people. Gates said this about the Pope.
our world of so much cultural diversity because his genome is truly cosmopolitan. I use the word ecumenical in the Greek sense, embracive of the world. And so he has ancestors from everywhere, including black ancestors, mixed race ancestors, slave owners, enslaved, the whole thing.
This is the story of the Americas, right? It's messy, it's complicated, and deeply human. My people, the man who just apologized for the document that started the African slave trade carries in his own blood the story of people that document was used to destroy. His grandfather fled from Haiti, the nation that broke slavery, to New Orleans, the heart of the American slave economy. His family passed as white to survive the consequences of the very system that the Vatican helped build. And now he sits in Rome, in the chair of the very institution that signed the permission slip. And he says, I ask for pardon. My people, if that is not the most layered, the most painful, and most extraordinary story in the world right now, then I don't know what is. But let's be clear about something, right? This apology is historic, yes. For centuries, the Vatican's position was essentially this: the church has always upheld the dignity of every human being. Individual Christians may have done wrong, but the institution itself, the Holy See, not our problem. That position just ended. On Monday, Leo changed the conversation entirely. Here's what he said directly on the record in his first official encyclical, quote, neither can we deny or diminish the delay with which both society and the church came to denounce the scourge of slavery. In antiquity and the Middle Ages, many individuals and even ecclesiastical institutions had slaves. Already in the early modern period, the Apostolic See of Rome, responding to requests from sovereigns, intervened several times in order to regulate and legitimize forms of subjugation, and in certain cases, the enslavement of infidels. End quote. The Apostolic See, not just individual Christians, he said, the See of the Vatican itself. And then he continues, quote, it was only in the 19th century that a formal, absolute, and universal condemnation of slavery was clearly articulated, notably under Pope Leo XIII. This development offers a clear example of the Church's growth in understanding the perennial truths of revelation that she safeguards. Although there was not always consistency in practice, given that slavery was long tolerated before being unequivocally condemned, there has been a continuous affirmation throughout history of the dignity of every human being created in the image of God, even if it took 18 centuries for its full incompatibility with slavery to be explicitly recognized. This constitutes a wound in Christian memory, one from which we cannot consider ourselves detached. It is impossible not to feel deep sorrow when contemplating the immense suffering and humiliation endured by so many, in stark contrast to their immeasurable dignity as persons, infinitely loved by the Lord. And for this, in the name of the Church, I sincerely ask for pardon. End quote. My people, 18 centuries is how long it took for the Church to finally condemn slavery. And now, in 2026, is the first time a pope has officially apologized on behalf of the Church. So yes, this moment matters. The words matter. But my people, I really need us to ask the harder question. Because here's what the apology does not say. The papal bulls, Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, the actual documents that authorize the slave trade, they've never been formally revoked. In 2023, the Vatican repudiated the doctrine of discovery that grew out of those bulls. But the bulls themselves, they're still technically valid Vatican documents. The apology came from a man, but the paperwork is still on the books. And then there's this. Just 2 months before this apology, on March 25th, 2026, something happened at the United Nations that should have made front pages around the world everywhere, but most people missed it. Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama, standing at the United Nations on behalf of the entire African Union, brought forward a resolution to formally declare the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity in history. 123 countries voted yes. 123. 3 countries voted no. The United States of America, Argentina, and Israel. And the countries that abstained, the entire European Union. Yeah, including Portugal, including Spain. Portugal, the country that received those papal bulls in 1452. The country that builds the first slave trade on the west coast of Africa using God's permission as their cover story. In 2026, Portugal abstained from a vote recognizing what that slave trade did to humanity. And now the Vatican says, sorry. But Portugal still hasn't. And the United States, the country that benefited more than any other from enslaved African labor, voted no. So when people think about the picture that paints, the Pope, whose family survived the consequences of the slave trade by disappearing into whiteness, issues an apology from Rome. And the nations that built their wealth on that trade are still not ready to call it what it is. So the question that sits underneath all of this is not, was the apology real? The question is, what comes after sorry? What comes after? Because an apology without revoking the documents is a press release. An apology without the nations involved actually following suit is a headline. And an apology without reparations from one of the wealthiest institutions on earth is a beginning, yes, but not an ending. Historian Shannon D. Williams calls this apology a monumental step toward the kind of essential truth-telling and reparation that many Catholics have prayed and worked to witness. She used the word reparation, not just apology, but action. And that is the word that every government, every institution, and every country still refusing to say needs to hear. Now, my people, this is the part of the story that I really need us to pay attention to. Because what happened this week is not an isolated event. You see it as a pattern. And once you see it, well, you cannot unsee it. Just 8 days before the Pope issued this apology, something else happened in Edinburgh, Scotland, that barely made the news. On May 17th, the Church of Scotland issued a formal apology for its historical role in slavery, adopted at the church's General Assembly in Edinburgh. The Church of Scotland, also known as the Kirk, is the National Church of Scotland. 5 million members, centuries of history. And for all those centuries, some of its members had given a theological justification for slavery before its abolition in Scots law in 1778 and the British Empire in the 1830s. Others had directly or indirectly benefited from the transatlantic chattel slave trade, with wealth contributing to the building of churches and universities to train ministers. And let that land. The churches built with slave money. The ministers trained with slave money. The institutions that shaped Scottish society funded brick by brick by the suffering of African people. And the words that they chose for their apology, quote, "We are grieved beyond telling by the extraordinary suffering that we have inflicted through our actions and our inaction on our brothers and sisters. We repent, committing ourselves to changing course and bearing fruit worthy of repentance. End quote. Grieved beyond telling. Now here's what makes the Church of Scotland's apology different from just words on a paper, right? Before issuing the apology, they went to Jamaica, an ecumenical pilgrimage to the Caribbean, building relationships with the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, and the Presbyterian Church in Trinidad and Tobago. They sat with the people. They listened to the communities still living with the consequences. And having made that journey, the church committed to reparatory next steps. Not just, sorry, but a commitment to action, a working group. Next steps to be brought to the 2027 General Assembly. Two of the most significant Christian institutions in the Western world, both saying for the first time in their histories, we were wrong, we were complicit, and we're sorry. And this is coming less than 2 months after 123 nations at the United Nations voted to declare the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity, spearheaded by Ghana and the African Union. And we cannot forget about the Church of England too, which has also already apologized for its role in slavery and put 100 million euros on the table for a reparative fund, and is being pushed to do more. It's being pushed to 1 billion euros. So now ask yourself, what is happening here? Because this is not a coincidence. Something is shifting slowly, imperfectly, but make no mistake, something is moving. The question that the very Reverend Sally Foster Fulton asked in Edinburgh, the woman who actually presented the Church of Scotland's apology, is the same question that echoes through all of this. Healing begins where truth is spoken. Truth is being spoken in Rome, in Edinburgh, in New York, at the United Nations. But truth without action is still just a statement. And my people, this is the part of the story that I really need us to pay attention to, because this is not just about the Catholic Church. What happened this week is a convergence, right? A collision of forces that have been building for years. And it is telling us something very important about where the world is right now. Think about the timeline. Ghana leads the African Union in pushing a UN resolution that names the slave trade the greatest crime in human history. It passes, the US votes no, Europe abstains. 2 months later, the Pope, a man carrying Black ancestry, issues the first ever Vatican apology for directly authorizing that trade. And he buries it deliberately inside a document about artificial intelligence. My people, that is not an accident, because Pope Leo made a direct argument inside that encyclical. He said the church's past failure, authorizing the extraction of African bodies in 1452, must be held up as a warning against what is happening right now. The unregulated labor conditions in the mines where the minerals for AI chips are extracted, cobalt from the Congo, children in those mines, wealth flowing out, and suffering staying in. He was saying that we helped build the system that exploited African people for 5 centuries. We cannot be silent while a new version of that system is being built right now, right before our eyes, with algorithms instead of ships, with rare earth minerals instead of cotton, with supply chains instead of chains. And my people, that connection is very real, because the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, holds 70% of the world's cobalt reserves. That cobalt goes into every AI chip, every electric vehicle, every smartphone that you're holding right now. And I have a special episode coming for you just about that. The same continent, the same extraction, the same question of who gets the wealth and who gets the cost. Yeah, the Pope is the first major Western religious leader to name that connection out loud. And it matters because what we're witnessing in this moment between Ghana's UN resolution, the papal apology, and the silence of Europe and America is a global argument about accountability. And whether the world is ready to move from acknowledgement to action, from sorry to something. And right now, the answer is not clear. It is not. And so where do we go from here, my people? Because this story does not have a clean ending, at least not yet. The papal bulls are still on the books. Portugal and Spain have still not made their own accounting. The United States voted no at the United Nations. No to calling the slave trade a crime against humanity. And the Vatican, for all the power of what the Pope said, his words, still has not announced any concrete steps towards reparatory justice or action. But something has shifted. For the first time, the institution that wrote the permission slip has admitted it. For the first time, 123 nations stood up at the UN and said this was the gravest crime in history. For the first time, the man holding the most powerful religious office in the world is someone whose own family lived inside the story that he just apologized for. History moved this week, yes, slowly, painfully, incompletely, but it did move. And I believe the pressure is only going to grow because Ghana is not done. The African Union is not done. And the millions of people across Africa and the diaspora who have been waiting, not for an apology, but for something real, they're not done either. And so now I turn it over to you. Do you think the Pope's apology is meaningful, or is it too little too late? Should the Vatican formally revoke the papal bulls that started all of this? And what do you think real accountability looks like? Not just from the church, but from Portugal, from Spain, and the United States. Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. Because again, this is why this community is here. And also tell me where you're tuning in from. We have people joining us from all across the world, Africa, UK, Caribbean, Americas, and I love knowing where in the world this conversation is reaching you. And before I let you go, a very quick couple of updates and reminders for you. Our homecoming tour is coming up in Ghana, 2027, and spots are filling up fast. If you have been thinking about visiting Africa, not just as a tourist, but with intention and purpose, to understand the landscape, to explore opportunities, to engage meaningfully, I would love to invite you to join me in a community of global leaders, thinkers, and investors for this trip. The link is in the description box. Fill it out, complete the interest form.
Recorded May 28th, 2026.
Find our channel there at PanaGenius TV. Join us there so you never miss what we're sharing. Once again, I'm Sandra Bebu Boateng, and until next time, I'll see you then.